Although there were settlements on the American frontier for hundreds of years before the Civil War, when historians talk about life in the Old West, they usually refer to the period 1865 to 1890. Illegal activity in the Wild West increased in the early 20th century, and the vocation, although not an actual term of bounty hunter, existed before the Civil War as well as in other parts of the country. In Western-themed movies, TV shows, and literature, the bounty hunter is often portrayed as a rather obscure figure, a lone wolf with no real connection to the law who received huge rewards for catching or killing an outlaw. In reality, they were more often lawyers or people who worked in detective agencies, railways, or banks. And the rewards were usually small, so small that very few could work as full-time bounty hunters. Movies and stories seem to hold that many such hunters were morally reprehensible. In fact, several of the more famous were outlaws themselves, or later became outlaws. John Riley Duncan was a bounty hunter and Texas Ranger who helped capture John Wesley Hardin. John Riley Jack Duncan was 26 years old when he joined the Dallas police force in 1876. The following year, he was recruited by the Texas Rangers as Texas Rangers believed Hardin was hiding in Gonzales County. Using the pseudonym Williams, Duncan moved to the district and worked as a laborer and craftsman. He pledged his loyalty to the people of Hardin County and even befriended Neil Bowen, the lawmaker's father-in-law, who took Williams to the county. After Duncan tricked Bowen into writing a letter to Hardin, he found the lawman hiding out in Pollard, IL, under the alias J.H. Swain. Undercover Duncan then arranged for the guards to arrest Williams to prove that he was a member of Hardin band. Provided with the promises of both Hardin and Swain, Duncan and another Texas Ranger, John Armstrong, traveled to Alabama, where the former scholar, Swain, was on his way to Pensacola, Florida, to play. 23 August 1877, Duncan, Armstrong, Escambia County, Sheriff William Henry Hutchinson, and Deputy Sheriff A.J. Duncan and Armstrong split the $4,000 reward, but the former left the Texas Rangers after just 4 months to work as a detective and bounty hunter in Dallas. He was haunted by dreams of shooting Hardin or one of his friends to death, because the captured outlaw had sworn revenge on the man largely responsible while in prison. He was shot, but not Hardin or any of his friends. Instead, in February 1878, brothel worker Hattie Washburn, aka Hattie Bates, shot Duncan with her own gun. The bullet lodged in his lung. Despite having a silver tube in his throat that allowed him to speak and breathe, Duncan continued to work for several years. He died in a car accident in 1911. Apaches as a boy kidnapped bounty hunter Mickey Free. When the American Army tried to rescue him, they followed the wrong tribe and the Kirker Wars broke out. Born in Mexico around 1848, Felix Telles, who later became Mickey Free, grew up in the Arizona Territory. When he was 12 years old, he was kidnapped by the Penal Apache. In late January 1861, a U.S. Army unit led by 2nd Lieutenant George E. Bascom began searching for the boy. A meeting was arranged between Bascom and Cochise, the Kirker Apache chief, whom the Army mistakenly believed had been captured by Telles. When Cochise denied knowing about the boy, Bascom threatened to detain the Kirker Apache leader until Telles was released. Although Cochise escaped, Bascom captured another Apache in the party. Cochise then killed 3 hostages taken from a nearby stage, while Bascom hanged Cochise's brother and 2 nephews. That incident destroyed the fragile peace between the American Army and the Kirker Apache. Raised as an Apache, Telles was finally captured years later when American soldiers raided the Apache camp where he lived. Renamed Mickey Free, he became an interpreter in 1874 because he was fluent in the Apache language and spoke Spanish, although he apparently could not speak English. Within a few years, he became a famous Apache scout working with the U.S. Army. Donald McIntosh, the biracial son of another scout, described Free in the 1880 as follows: "I was only 15 at the time and had never seen anything like Mickey Vaba. He had on large cavalry boots, the kind that went up high above the knee, and a large pistol belt around his waist, and in it he had 2 large dragon pistols. He presented a beautiful character in the prime of his life. In addition to scouting, Free occasionally did bounty hunting. Among those he tracked down was the Apache Kid, the man Free was said to have killed. Most bounty hunters were peace officers or worked for detective agencies or private companies like Wells Fargo. Although bounty hunters were often portrayed in literature and film as a group of lone wolves or snipers not affiliated with any formal organization, in reality, most were lawyers looking to supplement their meager salaries. Lincoln County Sheriff Pat Garrett collected a bounty in 1880. One when he killed Billy the Kid, or worked in detective agencies such as the Pinkerton National Bureau of Investigation. Some also worked in banks or train operators. In an analysis of 255 shooters, only 3 were found to be bounty hunters who appeared in movies and on television, and even they only hunted occasionally. Most of the rewards were too small and or offered too infrequently for anyone to make a consistent living off of them. In Garrett's case, New Mexico Governor Lew Wallace placed a newspaper ad offering a reward for the capture of Billy the Kid. "I will pay a $500 reward to each person or person who captures William Bonney, alias the Kid, and deliver him to some sheriff in New Mexico. Satisfactory identification is required. LAWWULACENEUMEXICO." However, when Garrett tried to claim the award, Wallace tried to tell him that he was not entitled to it, claiming that it was a personal offer not binding on the territory itself. Garrett persisted and was finally rewarded, but not in front of local citizens, refused to honor the governor's offer, raised $1,150, and sent it to Garrett. Some of the most famous bounty hunters, the Dunn Brothers, were also involved in robberies and cattle rustling. B. Calvin, Dal, George, and Bill Dunn were 5 brothers from Pawnee. They kept a residence near Ingalls, where, according to legend, they hid an outlaw. The brothers also sometimes kidnapped or killed the travelers who stayed there. In addition, they ran a meat market in Pawnee, a convenient way to get rid of the occasional rustling cattle. According to one report, the Dunns struck a deal with law enforcement in which they agreed to help capture members of the outlaw Doolin Dalton gang in exchange for dropping criminal charges against them. Their younger sister, Rose, was romantically involved with George Bitter Creek Newcomb, and on May 2, 1895, she and Doolin Dalton member Charlie Pierce arrived at the ranch to meet him. There are conflicting accounts of what happened next, depending on the source. The brothers informed the law, who then killed the outlaws, or the Dunn brothers did Newcomb and Pierce themselves. In any case, Pierce and Newcomb were dead, and the Dunns reportedly collected $5,000 for each man. On August 25, 1896, Bill Dunn, the elder and leader of his brothers, led Deputy U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas and his pigs to where Bill Doolin was hiding. When the outlaw refused to surrender and opened fire, Thomas killed him. Some sources claim that Dunn was actually the one who shot the outlaw. Towards the end of 1896, the locals began to complain about the criminal activities of the brothers. Deputy Sheriff Frank Canton, himself a former outlaw, who had already tried to arrest Dunn for the Pierce and Newcomb murders, but failed to press charges, decided to investigate these complaints. This enraged Bill Dunn, who vowed to kill Canton at once. On November 6, 1896, he met a policeman coming out of a restaurant. He drew his gun, but Canton reacted faster and killed Dunn in self-defense. That was the end of the brothers' work as bounty hunters. The largest bounties ever offered in the Old West were $25,000 for Jesse James and $100,000 for John Wilkes Booth. Jesse James and his older brother Frank were 2 of the most famous outlaws in the history of the Old West. After the Civil War, they were part of several outlaw groups, mainly the James Younger Gang, which operated in Missouri from approximately 1868 to 1876. The group became notorious for bank and train robberies and brutal murders. It disbanded in 1876 after a botched robbery attempt in Northfield, MN that killed several members. The James brothers escaped and continued their illegal ways for several more years. In 1882, Missouri Governor Thomas T. Crittenden offered a $25,000 reward for the capture of Jesse dead or alive, and in $15,000 for Frank. Adjusted for inflation, the $40,000 total would be $2.4 million in 2020. Crittenden allegedly held secret meetings with Bob Ford, a new recruit to the James gang who was invited to live with Jesse and his family. On April 3, 1882, Ford sent Jesse on his way by shooting him in the head when the outlaw waved the picture. The $25,000 reward is probably one of the largest for an outlaw. But the sum offered for the capture of the assassin of President Abraham Lincoln was even higher. On April 20, 1865, the U.S. War Department offered John Wilkes Booth and accomplices David Harold and John Surratt a $50,000 reward, which Booth himself received. Adjusted for inflation, $100,000 would be about $9.8 million in 2020. Union soldiers found Booth and Harold in a Virginia barn. Although Harold, often misspelled Harold, surrendered, Booth was killed in the ensuing firefight. Harold and Surratt were later hanged for their roles in Lincoln's assassination. Many bounty hunters were more dangerous than outlaws. While some bounty hunters may have been upstanding citizens who never ran afoul of the law, many others had a lesser reputation. Some might even be considered more dangerous than the outlaws themselves. Take Henry Newton Brown. In 1882, he became Deputy Marshal of Caldwell, KS, and was later promoted to Marshal. The Caldwell advertising classified him as cool, brave, and gentlemanly, and free from vices. What the newspaper and local citizens did not know, however, was that Brown was a former outlaw who was part of Billy the Kid's gang and ambushed and murdered the Lincoln County NM sheriff during a local war in 1878. Farmers, businessmen, and politicians. Brown's lawless ways did not end after becoming a lawyer. In 1884, he received permission from the mayor of Caldwell to pursue a murderer in Indian Territory, hoping to collect a $1,200 reward. Instead, he joined forces with an outlaw in an attempted robbery of the Medicine Shack Bank, killing the manager. The robbers were caught and taken to Medicine Lodge Prison, where an angry mob shouted, "Hang them! Hang them!" Later that night, a mob broke into the jail and overpowered the sheriff and deputies. Brown was shot as he tried to flee. Then there was Timothy Longhair Jim Courtright. In 1876, he became the first elected marshal in the history of Fort Worth, Texas, and is credited with cutting the city's homicide rate in half. But he also made enemies among bar and gambling hall owners who did not like being forced to buy his protection services. This would later lead to a fight, a duel, and his death. Perhaps the most infamous bounty hunter was Tom Horn. In the late 1880s, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency hired him as a bounty hunter and stalker, but he spent only a short time with the company. He then became a weapon and is believed to be responsible for the murders of more than a dozen people. Ironically, Horn was hanged in 1903 after being convicted of a murder that many historians believe he did not commit, that of 14-year-old Willie Nickel, who was shot in the back on July 18, 1901. Charlie Lilac was Pinkerton, a detective who went undercover and successfully infiltrated Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch gang. Charlie Siringo is one of the most famous detectives of the 19th century and spent much of his life at the Pinkerton National Bureau of Investigation. Before becoming a detective, he was a cowboy. In the 1870s, he began working on the LX Ranch. While there, he searched for Billy the Kid after an outlaw stole part of the ranch. In 1884, Lawyer Ringo married and gave up his cowboy role to become a businessman. But in 1886, he moved to Chicago and got a job with Pinkerton using Pat Garrett, a man of many hats, including sheriff, customs officer, and killer of Billy the Kid, as reference material. Lilac would remain a detective for the next 22 years and make hundreds of arrests. He often worked in secret. In the late 1890s, he infiltrated Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, appearing as a gunman named Charles L. Carter, who was allegedly involved in the murder. In 1899, after the Wild Bunch committed the Wilcox train robbery, Lilac was assigned to capture the gang along with another Pinkerton agent, Tom Horn. Their efforts led to the capture of several members of the Wild Bunch, including Kid Curry. However, Cassidy and the Sundance Kid fled to Bolivia, where they were later killed by Bolivian soldiers. In 1907, Lilac retired to Pinkerton. The 1872 Supreme Court case Taylor v. Taintor, who stated that bounty hunters could move a fugitive to another state, break into the fugitive's home, and arrest the fugitive on the Sabbath. For nearly 150 years, bounty hunters, police, and bailiffs have cited a passage in the majority opinion of an 1872 Supreme Court case to show what rights they have to pursue and capture a fugitive. Taylor v. Taintor involved an $8,000 cash bond for Edward McGuire, who was charged with grand larceny. While awaiting trial in Connecticut, he returned home to New York. But unknown to the Connecticut bail bondsman, McGuire was wanted for another crime in Maine. At the request of the governor of Maine, the governor of New York extradited McGuire to Maine, where he was convicted and imprisoned for burglary. When he failed to appear in court in Connecticut, bail was withheld. The Connecticut bail bondsman sought relief on the forfeited bond, arguing that McGuire's failure to appear was not McGuire's fault, but rather because McGuire was extradited to Maine, which the extradition clause treats as interference as a matter of law. However, the Constitutional Court ruled that the bail counsel was responsible for ensuring McGuire's appearance and was not protected by the extradition clause. Although it is not a judicial decision or has prima facie binding value, bounty hunters continue to point to a passage in the majority opinion in Taylor v. Taintor to help them. It reads in part, "When guarantees are given, their powers are a continuation of the original imprisonment. If they want, they can catch him and hand him over when they leave, and if it cannot be done at once, they may imprison him till it be done. They can exercise their rights in person or through a representative. They may pursue him to another country, be arrested on the Sabbath, and may, if necessary, break and enter his house for that purpose." The term bounty hunter did not describe those who tracked and captured criminals before the 1950s. Bounty hunters have played an important role in many Hollywood westerns, from Henry Fonda in Tin Star to Clint Eastwood in Unforgiven. These films, along with literature and news reports, are responsible for perpetuating many myths about the Wild West. They also seem to be responsible for the term bounty hunter to describe the, mostly, male lawmen and gunslingers who tracked down, captured, and sometimes deported all manner of criminals. The term fee dates back to the early 14th century. Its original meaning was goodness or goodness. Only at the beginning of the 18th century did the word acquire the meaning of reward, but in the form of a bonus given to men to entice them to join a country's army or navy. In the 19th century, the term bounty hunter was used to refer to people who received bonuses for collecting animal skins or dead birds, but not for tracking down and catching outlaws. American writer Norman A. Fox, who specializes in Western stories, used the word bounty hunter in its current meaning in 1953, followed in 1954 by American writer and screenwriter Elmore Leonard. James Kirker worked with the Mexican government to capture and kill Indian soldiers who invaded the northern part of the country. James Kirker was one of the most famous bounty hunters. Born in Ireland, he came to the United States at the age of 16 and worked as a privateer and trader, before spending about 10 years in New Mexico, trapping and trading beaver pelts, mining, and trading cattle with the Apaches. In 1835, Kirker became a citizen of Mexico, and in 1839, he signed the first of 4 treaties with the governor of Chihuahua to fight the invading Apaches, Comanches, and Navajos in northern Mexico. He formed a core group of approximately 25 fighters called the Cejuanos, or Shawnees, although it was a mixed group of white Americans, Mexicans, runaway slaves, and members of the Delaware, Creek, and Shawnee tribes. Kirker was promised $100,000 for his first contract, and the next 3 contracts were paid based on how many prisoners and scalps he delivered. He was quite successful at this task, but by 1846 the Chihuahuan government could no longer pay him for Apache scalps. Instead, he was offered a position with the rank of colonel in the Mexican army. He refused and instead joined the 1st Regiment of Missouri Mounted Volunteers, 1st Regiment of Missouri Mounted Volunteers, to fight in the Mexican-American War. This action led to the Mexican government declaring him a traitor and placing a 10,000 peso bounty on his head. Kirker survived the conflict and later settled in California, where he died in 1852. Most of the rewards were a few $100s, not the thousands we see in pop culture. Although Western movies might suggest otherwise, being a bounty hunter was not the best way to get rich. While some famous outlaws received large prizes, such as Jesse and Frank James' collective $40,000 and the Dalton Gang's $15,000, most of the wins were more modest. For example, Billy the Kid or Cole Younger were offered a $5,000 reward, while Butch Cassidy was only worth $4,000. Even those amounts were still good, as most prizes were less than $100. The U.S. government's wanted slave operation led to some bounty hunters kidnapping free blacks and selling them into slavery. The U.S. government enacted its first Fugitive Slave Act in 1793, which gave local governments the right to capture and return escaped enslaved people to their owners. The act also stated that slave owners and their agents had the right to search for fugitives in free states. When a suspected runaway was caught, the hunter went before a judge and presented evidence that the person had been enslaved. If the court was satisfied with the proof, the owner could take the fugitive back to his possessions. The law also imposed a $500 fine on anyone found to have aided a fugitive. There was widespread opposition to the law, especially in northern states where slavery had been abolished. Several of these states refused to enforce fugitive slave laws, and even passed personal liberty laws that gave accused fugitives the right to a jury trial. These laws also protected free blacks, many of whom were kidnapped by bounty hunters and sold into slavery. Solomon Northup described this type of shady business in his memoir 12 Years a Slave, where he told how he was born a free black in New York, but in 1841 was lured to Washington, where he was kidnapped and then sold into slavery. The legality of personal liberty laws was challenged in the Supreme Court case Prigg v. Pennsylvania, 1842, which involved a Maryland bounty hunter named Edward Prigg, who was convicted of kidnapping someone he thought was a runaway slave. The Supreme Court ruled in Prigg's favor, setting the precedent that federal law superseded any state measures that attempted to prevent the Fugitive Slave Act. Despite this decision, northern states continued to refuse to enforce the law. This led to the U.S. government passing another Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. This new law forced citizens to cooperate urgently in the capture of escaped slaves. It also denied fugitives the right to a jury trial and increased the penalty for aiding fugitives or breaking the law to a $1,000 fine and 6 months in prison. It also increased bounty hunting by handing over case management to federal commissioners who were paid more to return suspected fugitives than to release them.